Good evening. The story we are about to share is a work of American folklore, designed to evoke suspense and fear. It deals with supernatural themes and restless spirits. It is intended for mature audiences who enjoy the comfort of a good ghost story. Please, dim the lights and settle in. The mountains didn't welcome him. Arthur Vance felt this the moment his sensible sedan left the paved highway and turned onto the gravel artery of Route 42, which the locals ominously called the Spine. He was a man of facts, of carbon-dated vellum and cross-referenced historical indexes. He lived in Boston, in a clean, minimalist apartment where everything had its place. These mountains, the Virginia Blue Ridge, were the opposite. They were messy, ancient, and secretive. They were a place of myth, and Art, as a rule, detested myth. He was only here because of the inheritance. His great-aunt Elspeth, a woman his mother referred to only as that poor, strange woman, had passed, leaving him her only worldly possession. A cabin, 2 acres of undesirable woodland, and a mountain of debt. The cabin was, to Art's precise mind, a structural failure. It leaned to the left, as if trying to listen to something the ground was whispering. It was built of dark, heavy-cut logs, slick with generations of moss. The air around it was thick with the smell of wet pine, damp earth, and something metallic, like old blood or rust. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of water from the sagging porch roof and the sigh of the wind through the hemlocks. Right? Art muttered to the empty woods. Appraise, document, list, and leave. The key, iron and heavy as a railroad spike, stuck in the lock. He had to shoulder the door open, fighting a decade of swollen wood. The inside of the cabin was worse than he imagined. It wasn't empty. It was full. Great-aunt Elspeth had been a collector of things. The small front room was a labyrinth of stacked books, leaning towers of National Geographics, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and dozens of mason jars filled with murky liquids and unidentifiable objects. It was the den of a woman who saw portents in tea leaves and omens in the shape of a cloud. Art's academic sensibilities were offended. This wasn't history. It was hoarding. He spent the first few hours just clearing a path, bagging up rotting newspapers and wasp nests, his face covered with a bandana. He tried not to look too closely at the folk charms, the bundles of raven feathers tied with red string, the bowls of salt in every corner, the strange 5-pointed stars woven from corn husks. He found the diary on her writing desk, a small walnut table that overlooked the darkest part of the surrounding woods. It stood out from the clutter. While everything else in the cabin was covered in Appalachian dust and homemade superstition, the diary was regal. It was bound in thick, dark leather, now cracked and stiff with age. The corners were capped in brass, gone green with verdigris. But the centerpiece, embossed on the cover, was a tarnished but unmistakable royal crest. Art picked it up. It was heavy, the pages thick parchment. He recognized the crest, the coat of arms of the United Kingdom. Queen Victoria's diary? He said aloud, a laugh escaping him. Elspeth, you really were out of your mind. He assumed it was a clever replica, a high-quality tourist piece she'd picked up at an antique mall. He flipped it open. The pages were yellowed, but disturbingly blank. All of them, except for the very first page, which had only 2 words, written in Elspeth's shaky, spiderweb script. It listens. Art snapped the book shut, a sudden, inexplicable chill running up his arm. He dismissed it as a draft. The cabin was full of them. He placed the diary on the rough-hewn kitchen table, making a mental note to list it as Victorian-style replica, and continued his work. Darkness fell quickly in the mountains. It didn't creep in. It fell, like a thick, velvet blanket dropped over the cabin. The generator he'd fueled up provided a weak, flickering yellow light. The woods outside became a solid wall of black, and the silence became a presence. Art heated a can of soup on the propane stove, his breath fogging in the cold air. He was tired, unsettled, and eager to be back in Boston. That's when he heard it. It started softly, just at the edge of his hearing. A low, humming tune. It was a woman's voice, melodic but thin, like a recording played far away. He froze, spoon halfway to his mouth. He listened. The humming was outside, somewhere near the porch. It was a simple tune, one he recognized, though he couldn't immediately place it. He moved to the window, peering through the grimy glass. He saw nothing but the reflection of his own pale face and the dark, looming shapes of the trees. The humming stopped. He let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Animals, he reasoned, or the wind in a knothole. He turned back to his soup. The tune started again, closer this time, just outside the door. And this time he recognized it. It was God Save the Queen. Art dropped his spoon. It clattered loudly in the oppressive quiet. "Who's out there?" he called, his voice sounding thin. "This is private property." Only the wind answered, but the humming was gone. He spent the next hour checking every lock, which was pointless. The front door had a deadbolt, but the back door was only held shut by a hook and eye latch. He wedged a chair under the knob of the front door, feeling ridiculous. He decided to sleep in his clothes, laying out his sleeping bag on the dusty sofa, as far from the windows as possible. He was exhausted, and his skepticism was at war with the primitive fear crawling up his spine. He fell into a restless, dreamless sleep. When he woke, it was to the gray, watery light of dawn. The cabin was cold and silent. The chair was still wedged under the door. "See," he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "Wind. Nothing." He stood up, stretching the stiffness from his back. He walked to the kitchen to make coffee and stopped dead. The Queen Victoria diary was no longer on the kitchen table where he had left it. It was on the sofa, right on the pillow of his sleeping bag, exactly where his head had been. And it was open. The moral of this first encounter is a simple one, often learned too late by men of logic. Skepticism is a warm coat, but it offers no protection when the cold wind of the impossible begins to blow. Art stared at the open book, his heart hammering. The page was still blank, but he couldn't shake the feeling, the terrifying, impossible feeling, that the diary had been waiting for him to finally start writing. Welcome back to Scary Folk Tales USA. Before we continue Art Vance's journey into the Appalachian shadows, we remind our audience that this story contains suspenseful and frightening elements rooted in American folklore. Proceed with caution and respect for the legends we explore. The logical mind, when confronted with the illogical, does not immediately concede defeat. It searches for mechanics, for trickery, for any explanation beyond the supernatural. Arthur Vance spent the entire morning trying to reconstruct the previous night. Perhaps the blast of wind, which had sounded like a woman humming, had also somehow shifted the front door just enough to pop the wedge, allowing him to sleepwalk the diary from the table to the sofa. He didn't believe it for a second, but it was the only theory that didn't involve ghosts. He placed the heavy book back on the kitchen table, his fingers lingering on the brass crest, a relic of a queen whose spectral reach seemed to extend across an ocean. He forced himself back to work. His task was to catalog the estate, and he intended to do it. He opened a massive, decaying wooden steamer trunk near the hearth, hoping to find valuables or, at the very least, sellable antiques. What he found was history, but of a very unsettling kind. The trunk contained not silver or porcelain, but instruments of the valley. shovel heads thick with rust, an iron trap without teeth, and, in a small, compartmentalized section, a mahogany box. Inside the box, arranged in 2 neat rows, were 20 small brass tokens. These were common in 19th-century American mining towns, check tokens or tally tokens. Each one identified a miner working below ground, serving as a rudimentary roll call. If a shift ended and a miner's token remained on the board, it meant he was still in the dark. Art, the historian, felt a professional flicker of interest. He reached for the first token in the top row. It was marked with a simple number, 19. The moment his fingers brushed the cold brass, a jolt of ice water shot up his arm, settling deep in his chest. His hand clenched around the token with a startling, painful spasm. It wasn't just cold. It was the chilling, compressive weight of granite settling on his lungs. The air in the cabin, which had been merely damp, suddenly became thick with the unmistakable smell of coal dust and wet rock. A voice, not his own, screamed in the silent gallery of his mind. The light. They forgot the light. Art stumbled back, hitting the kitchen table. His legs buckled, and he collapsed onto the chair, the token still gripped so tightly it cut into his palm. He tried to open his hand, to drop the wretched thing, but his muscles were locked. His head snapped toward the diary. It was open again, lying flat on the table, the parchment page a blinding white in the gloom. Then the compulsion began. Art found the pen his aunt had left there, a heavy, old fountain pen, and his hand moved. It was no longer his hand. It wrote with a smooth, frantic authority, the letters impossibly elegant, as if channeling a scribe from a century past. He could only watch as the ink flowed, documenting a story he did not know, had never heard, and desperately did not want to be a part of. The script filled the page with the tale of the weeping miner. Entry number 1. The miner's last whistle. The year was 1893. The place, the deepest vein of the old King coal mine, 20 miles from this spot, where the earth gives up its bounty only through pain. The man was Silas Creed, a simple man, whose life was measured by the shift whistle, the sound that announced his freedom. Silas, nicknamed Shift Whistle Silas for his habit of always timing his work to the exact minute of the whistle's blow, was deep in the dark when the timbers groaned, a sound not of warning but of finality. A vein of unsupported slate gave way, and the mountain settled. It didn't rush. It compressed, slow and agonizing. He was trapped. His lamp was smashed. His world was reduced to the space between the broken timber and the stone that pressed his knees. The diary wrote of the suffocating, deep earth darkness, the slow seeping of mine water, and the knowledge that the collapse had cut him off from any help. It wrote in terrible detail of the sounds, the rats, the drip of water, and, eventually, the slowing beat of his own heart. The worst sound, however, was the one that never came. The shift whistle. The men above, panicked by the collapse, had sealed the shaft, sacrificing the few for the safety of the many. They never blew the whistle to signal the end of the shift. Silas, dying and delirious, waited for the whistle that would tell him it was safe to go home. He never heard it. So he took his own lips and began to mimic the sound, a high, thin, almost musical note, the only way he knew how to signal that his shift was over. And he whistles still. The tragedy is that he never realized his shift truly ended, and the earth became his grave. Any who hear the sudden, high, sharp whistle in the lonely dark of the valley are hearing Silas calling out his tally number, waiting for someone to retrieve his token. The trance broke. Art gasped, falling sideways as the token clattered harmlessly to the wooden floor. The metallic smell was gone. The cold receded. The silence of the mountain returned, but now it was a deafening, terrifying sound. He stared down at the elegant, sloping handwriting that covered the page. It was a complete folk tale, a perfect, cinematic script of localized, historical horror. And he had written it not by choice but by compulsion. The diary had used him as its recording device. He looked at the number 19 token on the floor, then at the box which still held 19 others. The mining tokens were the keys to the stories. A chill deeper than the cabin's cold settled in his soul. This was not a tourist replica. This was a supernatural archive, documenting the sorrows and legends of this mountain valley, and his aunt had somehow tethered the 20 greatest, most tragic stories to this old British artifact. He had planned to leave today, to be safe, warm, and logical, but now he couldn't. He had written the first page of a dreadful new book, and the fate of Shift Whistle Silas, forever trapped, felt like a warning that resonated through the damp, heavy walls of the cabin. The moral Art could pull from this profound shock was that some tragedies are so profound they do not merely fade into history. They stain the very earth, demanding to be remembered, demanding to be told. Art picked up the pen, his hand now steady. He saw the box of 19 remaining tokens, and the 19 blank pages in the diary. Who are the others? He wondered with a chilling curiosity. What American horrors did Queen Victoria's diary come here to hide? He glanced towards the trunk, searching for the box's contents, realizing the answer to the next question lay just outside the cabin, waiting for its song to be recorded. Welcome back to Scary Folk Tales USA. We are following Arthur Vance deeper into the secrets of the Blue Ridge Mountains and the terrifying inheritance left by his great-aunt Elspeth. This segment explores themes of Appalachian folklore and cautionary tales. Viewer discretion is advised. The practical mind, once shattered, becomes intensely focused on the pieces. Art Vance, the meticulous historian, was no longer trying to rationalize the humming or the misplaced book. He was studying the artifact. The Queen Victoria diary was a conduit, a storage device for localized, concentrated psychic trauma. The 20 brass tokens, the tally markers, were the keys. He carefully placed the now completed page of The Weeping Miner on the left, facing the newly blank page on the right. He locked the other 19 tokens back in their box, pushing them beneath a pile of old linens in the trunk. His new, desperate goal was simple: survival by documentation. He had to understand the rules of this terrifying game before it swallowed him whole. Art left the cabin, seeking air and the reassurance of civilization. He drove his sedan down the spine, the gravel crunching beneath the tires, until he reached the small, fading town of Hollow Creek. The local historical society was a single room above a general store, smelling heavily of coffee and floor polish. He spoke to Mrs. Clara Jenkins, a woman whose face held the deep, enduring suspicion common among those who live in beautiful, isolated places. Art inquired about the old King coal mine and a miner named Silas Creed. Mrs. Jenkins didn't need to consult a record. "Shift Whistle Silas," she said, her voice a low rumble. "That was the first big tragedy back in '93. They say if you wait long enough at the old mine road, you can still hear the wind whistle his tune." She eyed Art with sudden intensity. "That's not just history, mister. That's a truth of this valley." Art bought a local history book, realizing his great-aunt Elspeth had been compiling a list of truths, not fictions. He drove back to the cabin, the sun now sinking below the high, jagged ridge. He approached the dark logs of the cabin with a profound dread, no longer seeing a fixer-upper, but a warden's keep. As he neared the front porch, he saw it. It hadn't been there when he left. Lying on the lowest step, nestled among the pine needles, was the second object. It was small, curved, and patinated green, a broken harmonica. He knew instantly this was the key to the next haunting. It had not been in the trunk. It had been left for him. The spirit of the diary, or the entities it contained, were actively participating in their own release. He picked it up. The metal was cold, slick, and strangely heavy. There was no intense psychic shock like before, only a faint, mournful vibration that seemed to settle in the hollow of his collarbone. He went inside, sat at the writing desk, and opened the diary to the 3rd page. He didn't bother to fight the compulsion this time. He dipped the pen and surrendered his will. His hand began to write, the elegant, archaic script pouring out the details of a local legend Art had never encountered in his academic texts. Entry number 2. The Crossroads Boy. At the deepest point of the valley, where the old logging road splits 3 ways, a true Appalachian crossroads, there is a patch of ground that will never grow grass. The legend is centuries old, but the boy's ghost is modern. The boy was Daniel "Danny" Weaver, and his tragic shift came in 1957. He was poor, desperate, and talented, carrying the music of the hills on his small silver harmonica. He believed the old folk tales, that if you played a song of deep longing at the crossroads at midnight, the gentleman in shadows would appear, offering a deal. Danny wanted fame. He wanted to escape the hunger. He played the song. The gentleman appeared. Danny sold his future. Not his soul, but his memory and his way home, for the promise of riches. The diary wrote of the horrific price. Danny awoke, miles from the crossroads, a strange, beautiful melody locked in his mind, but with no memory of his family, his town, or his own name. He wandered the county roads, playing the harmonica, the beautiful music failing to unlock the door to his memory. When he finally died of exposure, an unsung, forgotten stranger, his spirit returned to the crossroads. Now, he plays his broken harmonica not for fame but as a warning. The tune is achingly beautiful but carries a profound sorrow. If you hear the melody on a lonely road, stop. It's Danny, trying to remind you to turn back before you reach the place where roads and futures diverge, where promises come with unseen costs. Art finished writing, his heart heavy not with fear, but with a deep, vicarious pity for the lost boy. The story was a profound cautionary tale, one he had heard countless times in folklore classes, but never one so specific, so real, as the tale of Danny Weaver and his broken harmonica. The moral was clear. Be cautious of paths that seem too easy, for the greatest cost is often what you willingly surrender in the dark. He leaned back, the image of a boy wandering lost on a mountain road haunting his vision. He had fulfilled the diary's command, documenting the second of the 20 hauntings. The energy in the cabin had shifted, becoming slightly lighter, almost expectant. The diary's need had been met. What is the 3rd item? Art wondered, his curiosity now fully entangled with his fear. The weeping miner was the tragedy of the deep earth. The crossroads boy, the cautionary legend of the road. Where does the 3rd one reside? In the sky? In the water? He knew he shouldn't look, knew he should burn the diary, but the historian in him, the man who demanded the full truth, couldn't stop. He needed to know the next story, the next American horror, that the regal British book was so determined to uncover in the isolated, whispering heart of the Appalachian Mountains. Welcome back to Scary Folk Tales USA. Arthur Vance has documented 2 of the 20 hauntings held within the Queen Victoria Diary. This part takes us into the deeper woods, where ancient American cryptids guard their secrets. Please be advised this segment contains themes of wilderness horror and paranoia. The cabin's isolation, once an inconvenience to Art Vance, was now a hostile certainty. He had spent the morning of the 3rd day studying the 2 entries, the despair of the weeping miner, Silas Creed, and the profound regret of the crossroads boy, Danny Weaver. He understood the mechanism now. The diary was dormant until it encountered a tangible, emotionally charged artifact linked to a local tragedy. The royal crest and the old British leather were merely a container, perhaps an ancient European spirit trap, that had been brought to America and filled with the potent, concentrated sorrows of the Blue Ridge Mountains. But the question remained, who was delivering the keys? The brass token was in the trunk. The harmonica was left on his porch. Something or someone was guiding him. Art's mind went back to the hauntingly thin, melodic humming of God Save the Queen. He suddenly saw his great-aunt Elspeth not as a crazy woman obsessed with trinkets, but as the warden of the 20, a sentinel in this rotting wooden fortress. She wasn't collecting the items. She was guarding them, and now, in her absence, the contents were escaping, demanding their stories be written before they could roam free. He had to find the source of the humming. He had to understand his aunt's ritual, which seemed intrinsically linked to the woods directly behind the cabin. Armed only with a strong flashlight and the awful, compulsive curiosity of a man of history, Art pushed through the rickety back door. The Appalachian woods immediately swallowed the sunlight. The forest was dense, dominated by towering hemlocks and ancient oaks, their upper branches so thick the light filtered through in sickly green-gold shards. The ground was uneven, a carpet of slick moss, decayed leaves, and roots that looked like the exposed bones of some subterranean giant. This was not a park. This was a wilderness that tolerated human presence, but did not welcome it. Art was looking for a path, a sign, anything that looked like human intervention. Instead, he found the unsettling quiet. The normal chorus of birds and insects was muted, replaced by a deep, breath-holding silence. After 20 minutes of slipping and stumbling, Art noticed an anomaly. He was standing in a small, circular clearing that seemed too flat, too barren for the surrounding terrain. And there, carved into the trunk of a massive, gnarled oak, was a figure. It was crude, but unmistakable. The head of a cat, carved deep into the wood, its features elongated, its eyes merely two deep gouges. Tied to the base of the tree, half buried in the soil, was the third artifact. It was a small, crudely carved wooden idol. Not a toy, but a talisman. It was obviously intended to represent a feline form, but the limbs were strangely proportioned, almost like a woman crouching. This was the key. This was the entity of the woods. Art hesitated, the memory of the freezing coal dust and the mournful harmonica a powerful deterrent. But the diary's call, the compelling need to complete the document, was a physical force he could no longer resist. He reached down and grasped the idol. The shock was entirely different this time. It wasn't cold or suffocating. It was feral. A surge of pure, animalistic rage and territoriality flooded his senses. Art could hear the sound of heavy paws thudding on the earth, the low, throaty snarl of a beast protecting its den. He tasted blood and stale fear. He staggered back toward the oak, the compulsion overwhelming. He slammed the small wooden cat onto the diary's empty page and began to write, his hand mimicking the wild, almost claw-like aggression of the spirit. Entry number 3. The Wampus Cat, the Shadow of the Woods. Some spirits are born of deep earth sorrow. Others are born of deep human jealousy. The legend of the Wampus Cat is as old as the mountains themselves, predating the miners and the settlers. It began with an act of betrayal. She was the village elder's wife, consumed by a green jealousy after catching her husband, the tribe's shaman, watching the sacred hunting rituals of the men, disguised in the skin of a wild panther. She, forbidden by custom, watched him as he sought the beast's power. But the shaman knew she was there. The diary wrote of the shaman's ancient, terrible curse. You sought the shadows and the power of the beast. You shall be a shadow, and your power shall be eternally cursed. She did not merely transform. She was twisted. She became the Wampus Cat, a sleek, terrible cryptid, half woman in her anguish, half panther in her rage. She walks on two legs when she weeps and stalks on four when she hunts. The curse is simple. She is forced to guard the darkest, most isolated parts of the forest. Her presence ensures no hunter or logger trespasses without respect. She is the physical manifestation of the wilderness saying, "You are not welcome here." You know her presence when you smell a faint scent of jasmine, her favorite flower, just before you see the two glowing, hungry yellow eyes in the deep, encompassing dark. Art dropped the pen, panting, the smell of jasmine and old pine sharp in his nose. The compulsion vanished, replaced by a crippling, bone-deep fear. He had not just written a story, he had summoned a sentinel. He looked up from the diary, his eyes desperately scanning the edge of the clearing. He didn't need the diary to tell him where the danger lay. He had heard the legend, and now his senses were hyper-aware. He saw the movement first, a flicker of something too fast and too low to be a deer. Then, as he frantically shined his flashlight into the underbrush, the beam caught them. Two perfect, luminous yellow circles, staring back from the deep shadows of the treeline. They were low to the ground, unblinking, and utterly predatory. "You are." He snatched the diary and sprinted, crashing through the brush and over roots, the heavy-cut logs of the cabin now his only sanctuary. Behind him, he heard a sound. Not a howl, but a sharp, wet snarl, immediately followed by the rhythmic, heavy thud of a large animal bounding after him. He slammed the back door shut, fighting the swollen wood, dropping the latch and wedging the old kitchen chair beneath the knob. He collapsed against the wood, listening to the heavy breathing outside. The scratching started moments later, slow, deliberate scraping sounds against the logs, inches from his head. The moral of the encounter was etched deep in the scratches on the cabin wall. Respect the boundaries of the wilderness and the legends that protect it, for some creatures are not merely animals. They are the ancient, jealous spirit of the land itself. Art Vance had survived the woods, but now he was trapped inside the cabin. He had documented the cold earth, the lonely road, and the primal forest. 3 stories down, 17 to go. He knew that the spirits he had documented were now free to roam the valley, but the next key, the next story, was already waiting for him. As he looked around the cluttered, creaking room, he realized with dawning horror that the next haunting might not come from the woods. It might already be in the walls. Welcome back to Scary Folk Tales USA. Arthur Vance is now a prisoner in his gray tant's cabin, trapped between the threats of the wild forest and the secrets of the house itself. This segment explores the tragedy of betrayal and the spirits that cling to the very foundations of American homesteads. Proceed with caution. Fear had a smell, Art realized. It smelled like cold sweat, old dust, and the sharp ozone sting that lingered after the Wampus Cat's enraged snarl. He had survived the night, shivering beneath every blanket in the cabin, listening to the furious scratching outside the back door. The Wampus Cat, the spirit of territorial rage, was still close, a palpable, heavy tension clinging to the forest air. But the greatest terror was now internal. The cold hearth, the chilling ghost of Jeremiah, was at war with the Wampus Cat's anger. The air was frigid, the cabin fighting the natural warmth of life, seeking to replicate the final, fatal chill of its founder. Art was losing the battle against the cold. He had to light the fire. He crept to the massive, fieldstone fireplace that dominated the cabin's main wall. It was the oldest feature of the house, built from stones hauled directly from the valley floor. It was also, Art realized, the most neglected. The chimney was choked, and the grate was twisted and black, as if it had been intensely hated. He had fuel and kindling, but he felt an enormous, heavy reluctance to touch the hearth. He looked for a key, an object that would explain the deep, spiritual aversion to warmth. He dug into the cold, dusty ash pile. His hands recoiled, not from dirt, but from an overwhelming sense of abandonment. He pushed deeper, sifting through the gritty remains of generations of fires. And there it was, not a beautiful artifact, but a horrifying memento. A tiny, white sliver of human bone, smoothed and polished by fire, mixed in with the ash. It was a fragment of a finger or toe, a horrifying relic left in the dust of the hearth. Art didn't need a token to tell him this was the key to the fourth haunting. The bone shard represented the final, irreducible core of the cabin's original owner. He picked up the sliver, and the world dissolved into an icy gray. The cold was instantaneous, total, and crippling. Art felt the air being drawn from his lungs, replaced by the deep, crushing weight of snow and ice. He wasn't just cold. He was freezing from the inside out, experiencing the slow, creeping shutdown of the body as hypothermia set in. He was sitting at the hearth, but the compulsion drove him to the desk, the bone shard shaking in his hand. The pen fell to the page, and the archaic script began to write the story of the cabin's first resident. Entry number 4, The Cold Hearth. Jeremiah Vance, Great-Aunt Elspeth's ancestor, built this cabin with his own 2 hands in the terrible winter of 1832. He had a partner, a man named Thomas, who had promised to help him homestead the harsh Virginia land. They had worked side by side, trusting the other with their lives and their meager supplies. The diary wrote of the unforgivable sin, the betrayal. As the worst blizzard in living memory descended, trapping them for weeks, Thomas saw his chance. Jeremiah had prepared the winter's store of pelts and furs, enough to keep both men alive. Thomas slipped away one night, taking all the furs, all the food, and leaving Jeremiah to face the White Death alone. Jeremiah did not die quickly. He lived long enough to crawl to the unlit hearth, long enough to know the searing pain of absolute abandonment. The last sensation he had was the emptiness of the stone, the absence of the warmth that his own partner had condemned him to lose. His body was found weeks later, a grim, frozen sentinel by the hearth. The fire had never been lit. His spirit did not move on. It became tethered to the coldest part of the house, a constant, spiritual draft that seeks to steal the warmth from any who dare to find comfort within its walls. The cold hearth is the ghost of betrayal, residing forever in the stones of the cabin. Art finished the entry, his teeth chattering so violently he thought his jaw would break. He felt like he had just emerged from a frozen lake. He quickly threw the bone shard back into the ash and staggered away from the hearth, his whole body seized by shakes. He had solved the haunting, but the price was a night spent fighting for his life against the internal rage of a ghost who despised warmth. The diary had documented the deep injustice, and the cabin immediately felt fractionally less oppressive, though still deeply cold. He had realized the most terrible truth about his inheritance. His ancestor, Jeremiah, was the very first victim. The Vances had been plagued by this dark house from the start. The soft closure was the chilling understanding that betrayal is a cold that settles into the bones of a house, and a legacy of suffering can be built, stone by stone, into your family history. Art huddled beneath his meager blankets, the fear now mixed with a bitter resignation. He had documented 4 of the 20 hauntings: the earth, the road, the woods, and the home. As his eyes adjusted to the cabin's permanent gloom, they fell upon an object on the mantelpiece, slightly illuminated by the weak, morning light filtering through the window. It was small, tarnished, and military. A brass button with a stylized CSA inscription, a Confederate soldier's button. The next American sorrow, The next key was waiting for him, promising a story of war, loyalty, and perhaps a light that still burned for a path lost long ago. Welcome back to Scary Folk Tales USA. 5 days into his inheritance, Art Vance is realizing that this cabin is not just a place he owns. It is a cage. This part deals with the desperation of escape and a haunting rooted in the tragic loyalties of the American Civil War. Logic had failed. The wampus cat's claws were still fresh in the wood, and the chilling presence of Jeremiah, the cold hearth, ensured that no heat could find a purchase in the house. The solution, Art decided on the 5th day, was abandonment. A property could be sold as is, where is. He would call a contractor, hand over the key, and fly back to Boston, letting the ghosts settle their debts with the bank. He packed his bags in 3 minutes, grabbed his keys, and marched to the sedan. His historical duty was over. His survival instinct had taken control. He turned the key. The engine caught, gave a ragged, hopeful cough, and then died completely. The dashboard lights flickered erratically, buzzing like trapped wasps, and went dark. Art tried again. Nothing. The entire electrical system was inert. He checked the battery cables, which appeared intact, though strangely dusted with something resembling fine, black ash. It was mechanical failure, yes, but delivered with supernatural precision. The spirits were not finished with their chronicler. He was trapped. Just as the hot frustration threatened to boil over, a movement caught his eye. A small, rusty pickup truck was parked just off the spine. An elderly woman was standing by his mailbox, peering intently at the cabin. This was Mrs. Hesh, his nearest neighbor, who was known in Hollow Creek as the keeper of obscure knowledge and even more obscure livestock. Art walked over, weary and defeated. "Ma'am," he began, trying to keep his voice level. "I seem to be having car trouble." Mrs. Hesh didn't even look at the car. She looked directly at the front door of the cabin. "It ain't the car, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice dry as pine bark. "It's the book, Elspeth's book. It needs its words filled. You think those stories you writ are done with? They're just the first rain. They're waiting on the others. They won't let you leave until that book is satisfied." She pressed a heavy, iron keyring into his hand. "Your Aunt Elspeth was the warden. The book is empty, and the cells are open. You finish the book, or you become a story in it yourself." Then, without another word, she climbed into her truck and drove away, leaving Art with the chilling realization that the entire valley knew about the Queen Victoria diary. Resigned, Art returned to the cabin. He was not a prisoner of wood and stone. He was a hostage of folklore. He forced himself to approach the mantelpiece. The 5th key was waiting. A heavy, tarnished brass button, embossed with the faded initials CSA, Confederate States of America, a remnant of the devastating Civil War that had scarred the state forever. He picked it up. The sensation was immediate and profound. The heavy dampness of a wool uniform, the acrid smell of burning wood and black powder, and the exhaustion of an endless, desperate march. He sat at the desk, driven by the urgency of the soldier's need. His hand wrote entry number 5, the ghost light of the ridge. Entry number 5, the ghost light of the ridge. The year was 1864, the war a desperate, agonizing crawl. Private Thomas Knox, a young Confederate recruit from this valley, had been fighting for 3 years, sustained only by the promise of his beloved wife, Sarah, who lived just over the high ridge. The news reached him during a terrible rout. Sarah was desperately ill. Thomas made the choice of the heart over duty. He deserted. He took a single lantern and began the brutal 200-mile march home, ignoring the warnings of capture and execution. The diary wrote of the terrible irony. Thomas was shot by Union scouts just 3 miles from his home, right on the high ridge overlooking the valley. He died in the dark, his lantern smashed, his final, desperate march unfinished. But love, mixed with unresolved duty, is a powerful binding agent. His spirit did not rest. Thomas Knox still walks the high spine of the ridge every night, carrying a spectral lantern, the ridge light or spook light, that locals still see bobbing erratically in the dark. He is not malevolent. He is just lost, forever searching for his wife, unable to find the final 3 miles home. Art dropped the pen, the lingering smell of gunpowder fading. He had documented the soldier's desperate, eternal quest. The moral was a powerful one, especially in a land haunted by divided loyalties. Some quests, fueled by love or grief, do not end with death. They become an unending, luminous duty in the dark. Art looked out the window, past the scratching marks of the wampus cat, toward the high, dark spine of the ridge. And there it was, unmistakable, a small, intensely white light, bobbing rapidly, moving along the tree line in an impossible, non-human rhythm. The ghost light of the ridge was searching, and by documenting the story, Art had just confirmed its location. The light seemed to pause, then turned its spectral gaze directly toward the cabin. Art knew the light was not malevolent, but it was relentless. Private Knox had found his chronicler, and he was coming closer. As he backed away from the window, Art nearly tripped over a new object that had been placed carefully on the floor beside the hearth. It was long, narrow, and strangely intact. A letter sealed with dark, official-looking wax, somehow preserved over a century of damp mountain air. The next story, Art realized, would not be about a fight for home or life, but a desperate, final message that had never been delivered. Welcome back to Scary Folk Tales USA. Arthur Vance is now fully immersed in his inherited role as the chronicler of the Blue Ridge tragedies. In this part, we explore the haunting power of unfinished business, focusing on the loyalty that holds a soul between two worlds. The ghost light of the ridge, Thomas Knox, moved away after its brief, unnerving pause. It was searching, not attacking, a spectral embodiment of relentless, sorrowful duty. Art was relieved, but the relentless pressure of the diary's command, and the chilling confirmation from Mrs. Hesh, left him exhausted and resolute. He couldn't leave, not until the diary was satisfied. He had to finish the record. He looked down at the fifth key. It was a letter, long and narrow, the paper brittle and yellowed. It was carefully folded and sealed with a heavy glob of deep red wax, marked with a distinctive, swirling P. He recognized the style. It was a formal letter, perhaps a dismissal or an official notice, preserved perfectly from a time when the mail service was the valley's only connection to the outside world. He picked it up. This time, the compulsion was less aggressive. It was sorrowful and profoundly cold, like standing in a blizzard. Art felt the damp wool coat of a man walking into a gale, driven by duty and the cold imperative of the post. His hand shook as he placed the letter on the empty page. This was the entry for a ghost tied not to the earth or to betrayal, but to the desperate, sacred duty of communication. His hand began to write entry number 6, the spectral postman. Entry number 6, the spectral postman. The town of Hollow Creek, in its earliest days, depended entirely on the commitment of its first and only postman, Elias Pritchard. Elias was a man of unfailing loyalty. Rain, heat, or snow, if a letter was due, Elias would deliver it. His final, most important route occurred in the winter of 1901, when a terrible blizzard swept through the mountain passes. The diary wrote of the terrible final journey. Elias was carrying a small satchel containing a crucial 15 letters, messages of life, death, and fortune. that needed to reach the isolated farms and cabins before the roads froze solid. Among them was the letter with the red wax seal, addressed to the owner of this very cabin, great-great-great-Aunt Victoria, the matriarch of the valley. Elias made it almost to the center of Hollow Creek, but the blizzard overwhelmed him on the high, narrow crossing over the river gorge. He slipped on the ice and plummeted. His body was found weeks later, frozen solid, but his hand was still clutching the satchel. Only one letter had escaped, the one with the red wax seal, which was found lodged in the snowdrifts weeks later, near the cabin. His spirit did not find rest. The spectral postman still walks the old mail routes on nights of heavy fog or snow. He carries an invisible satchel, and his steps are accompanied by the faint, muffled rattling of his lost 15 letters, still waiting to be delivered. The tragedy is that he cannot rest until every piece of mail in his satchel is placed in its intended hands. Any who hear the sudden, faint jingle of keys and the rattle of old paper in the dark should beware. It means the postman is near, searching for his lost message. Art finished the entry, closing the diary gently. He had documented the sixth ghost, a spirit bound by loyalty and unfinished business. The letter, now the empty casing of a tragic tale, felt light and harmless in his hand. The ghost of Elias Pritchard, the spectral postman, was an eternal commitment to duty. Art felt a wave of profound empathy. He understood duty, it was the framework of his own life, but the idea of being bound by it forever was terrifying. The clear moral lesson learned from Elias's tragedy was that loyalty and duty are noble forces, but when betrayed by fate, they can become the strongest chains holding a soul to the earth. Art knew the feeling of being held captive by the unwritten story. He was the new postman, delivering the tragedies Elias could not. He felt the temperature in the cabin slightly normalize. The cold hearth had lessened its grip, perhaps recognizing the nobility of Elias's struggle. But the respite was brief. As Art started to clean up the desk, he saw that the next key had already materialized, placed directly on the blank 7th page of the Queen Victoria diary. It was small, mummified, and utterly heartbreaking. The stiff, dried carcass of a tiny canary. Its presence smelled faintly of dust and sulfur, hinting that the next haunting would take him back into the cold, claustrophobic darkness of the mountain's deepest veins. Welcome back to Scary Folk Tales USA. Arthur Vance now holds the key to the 7th haunting, a silent witness to a collective tragedy. This part takes us into the dark, suffocating heart of the mountain, where the spirits of greed and abandonment still cling to the silver mines of Appalachia. The tiny, dried body of the canary was a painful symbol. In the minds of the past, the bird was life's final warning. When the canary stopped singing, the men knew the deadly gas had arrived, and their time was up. Art looked at the small corpse on the diary page, realizing this wasn't just a relic. It was the unheard warning of an entire disaster. The canary, entry number 7, was a witness demanding testimony. He remembered Mrs. Hesch's cryptic advice. The book must be satisfied. He had been merely recording the stories, but perhaps to satisfy them, he needed to carry the relic back to its place of origin, to offer the witness to the ghost. His research at the Historical Society confirmed his suspicion: the Silver Creek mine disaster of 1910. It was a minor incident in the history books, mostly forgotten because the mine's owner, a ruthless industrialist named Cyrus Thorne, no relation to Art, thankfully, had quickly sealed the mine, refusing to pay for an expensive, risky rescue operation, claiming the 6 men inside were already lost to rockfall. Art knew what he had to do. He pocketed the canary, grabbed his strongest lamp, and set out for the long-abandoned mine entrance 2 miles up a treacherous, overgrown logging trail. The journey was difficult and unsettling. The Wampus cat had taught him that the woods were hostile, and the cold hearth ensured the mountain's chill permeated the day. When he finally reached the mine site, he found a terrifying scene. A rusted, massive steel door chained and padlocked to the stone, sealed over a century ago. It was a tomb. The air around the entrance was heavy, unnaturally still, and smelled distinctly of coal and sulfur, despite this being a silver mine. The shadow of the mine was waiting. Art knelt down by the grate, whispering an apology to the lost souls. He gently laid the mummified canary on the dusty earth right at the base of the sealed door. The compulsion struck immediately. A wave of desperate, shared suffocation, the panic of multiple men running out of air. Art dropped his head, clutching the diary, and began to channel the truth that Cyrus Thorne had buried. Entry number 7. The Miner's Canary, the Shadow of the Mine. The tragedy was not the rockfall. It was the abandonment. On a damp afternoon in 1910, a small gas pocket ruptured deep inside the Silver Creek mine. 6 men were trapped by a secondary collapse, but they were alive. They had enough air and water to last days. Their warning, however, had been silenced. The diary wrote of the terrible end of the small, feathered witness. The gas came first, and the canary, their last hope, fell dead in its cage. The men knew the toxic air was coming, but they lacked the necessary timber to shore up the collapse quickly. Above ground, Cyrus Thorne, the mine's owner, calculated the cost of the rescue. Too high. The rescue would ruin his profits. He ordered the shaft sealed. He condemned the men to a lingering, dark death, trading 6 lives for a balanced ledger. Their collective spirit, 6 men bound by the injustice of their sacrifice, remained trapped behind the sealed door. They are the shadow of the mine, a chilling, palpable presence of crushing weight and despair that holds the air around the entrance. They wait for someone to bear witness to the greed that killed them, and to give voice to the canary whose warning was never heeded. Art finished the entry, closing the book. The air immediately felt different. The crushing, suffocating weight receded, replaced by the natural, cool draft of the mountain. He felt no sense of release, only a terrible, deep sadness. He hadn't freed the spirits, but by documenting the crime, he had given the canary its voice and the miners their truth. The clear moral lesson drawn from the Silver Creek mine was evident in the silence of the sealed door. Greed does not just take wealth. It takes lives and destroys souls, leaving a destructive legacy that haunts the land forever. Art gathered his lamp and started the long walk back to the cabin. 6 ghosts had been chronicled, and for the first time Art felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't just recording history. He was correcting it, one tragic tale at a time. When he reached the relative sanctuary of the cabin, the next key was waiting for him, placed neatly on his writing desk. It was an anomaly. A piece of rich, purple velvet cloth, torn sharply as if ripped in haste. Its color and heavy texture suggested an ecclesiastical garment, perhaps a priest's stole. The air around it carried the faint, lingering smell of old incense and something sharp and acrid, like fear. The next haunting, Art realized, was not of the wilderness or industry, but of the unholy ground where faith and desecration met. Welcome back to Scary Folk Tales USA. 7 stories have been documented, and the ghosts of the Blue Ridge are restless. Arthur Vance now confronts a haunting born not of accidental tragedy, but of deliberate desecration, a foundational sin of the early American frontier. The cabin was becoming a crucible of sorrow. The documentation was complete, but the spirits of Silas, Danny, Jeremiah, and the others were now active entities, their stories recorded, but their souls unbound. The air was a constant war zone. The oppressive cold of the cold hearth battling the stifling dust of the weeping miner, all while the faint, mournful whistle fought against the beautiful, sad strains of the Crossroads Boys' harmonica. Art could barely sleep. He understood now the heavy burden his Aunt Elspeth had carried. She hadn't just written the book, she had kept the lid shut. He focused on the key to the 8th haunting, the torn fragment of purple velvet stole. It was thick and heavy, designed for formality and ritual, and it carried the distinct, unsettling aroma of aged incense mixed with the metallic tang of dried blood. This was a haunting of faith, or rather, the corruption of it. Art knew the central church in Hollow Creek, St. Jude's, was one of the valley's oldest buildings, dating back almost to the time of Jeremiah Vance. He drove out, his car miraculously starting this time, as if the diary's command superseded mechanical failure. He found Mrs. Hesh tending a small memorial garden outside St. Jude's. He showed her the stole fragment. Her eyes, already wise with mountain knowledge, turned cold with ancient grief. "That's Father Thomas's stole," she whispered. "He tore it himself. He knew the sin." Mrs. Hesh confirmed the dark truth that official history ignored. The earliest settlers, eager to plant their flag and their faith, had chosen the most prominent hill for St. Jude's. That hill, she explained, was an ancient, sacred burial mound for the indigenous people of the valley, the true first residents. The settlers, viewing the native practices as pagan, had simply built over the mound, disturbing hundreds of years of rest. Father Thomas, the first pastor, had discovered the truth after years of the church being plagued by strange sounds and unholy tremors. The guilt drove him mad. Art took the fragment of the stole back to the churchyard, standing on the unholy ground, the compulsion hitting him with the force of spiritual righteousness mixed with profound, ancient anger. He knew he couldn't write inside the church, so he sat on a crumbling granite bench outside the sanctuary door and channeled entry number 8, the pastor's stole, the unholy ground. Entry number 8, the pastor's stole, the unholy ground. The true horror of St. Jude's Church was not external. It was internal. The foundation was built not on rock, but on spiritual violence. The zeal of the early settlers had desecrated the burial ground of the valley's true ancestors, trapping the ancient spirits beneath their symbol of salvation. The diary wrote of Father Thomas's torment. The native spirits, angry and confused, never attacked the people. They attacked the structure. The church groaned, the candles guttered, and the sacred wine turned to dust. The spirits drove the pastor mad, forcing him to see the profound betrayal of building God's house upon the graves of others. In a frenzy of guilt, Father Thomas tore his sacred stole, the symbol of his office, in half. He left the ministry and spent his last years wandering the edges of the valley, desperately trying to warn people to move the church, to respect the earth, shouting that the ground itself would eventually rise up to reject the lie. He is the warning ghost. His spirit remains bound to the churchyard, not to pray, but to moan a perpetual, chilling warning. When the bells of St. Jude's ring at odd hours, they are not calling the faithful. They are ringing in the desperate, mad fear of the tormented pastor, trying to tell the town that their very foundation is a sin. Art closed the diary, tears stinging his eyes, not from fear, but from the immense tragedy of generational injustice. As he stood up, he felt a subtle but profound tremor beneath his boots, a vibration that felt less like an earthquake and more like a great, slow groan of wounded earth. The spirit of Father Thomas, the warning ghost, receded. He was no longer yelling. He was quiet, his warning recorded and his guilt acknowledged. The moral was an unsettling reminder of the price of the American frontier. Disrespecting the sacred grounds and ancestors of others creates a spiritual scar that no amount of ambition or belief can ever truly heal. 8 stories were complete. Art had documented the suffering of the miners, the deserters, the betrayed, and the sacrificed. He turned toward the cabin, the sun low in the sky, and saw the next key waiting for him on the desk. It wasn't an object of tragedy or duty, but of erasure. It was a small, ornate, empty picture frame, an oval of tarnished brass, utterly vacant. It suggested a haunting of someone who had been meticulously removed from every record, a ghost of forgotten identity. Welcome back to Scary Folk Tales USA. With 8 stories documented, Arthur Vance is nearing the truth of his great-aunt Elspeth's legacy. This part delves into the haunting power of erased history, where a forgotten identity seeks to be seen again. The empty picture frame on the desk was perhaps the most unsettling key yet. It represented not a person who had died, but a person who had been systematically unpersoned, removed from the records, their image meticulously erased from the valley's memory. Art ran his thumb over the tarnished brass. The feeling was chilling. A profound sense of loneliness, of being utterly unseen and unheard, even in a room full of people. This was a spirit of deliberate forgetting. He returned to Hollow Creek, to Mrs. Jenkins at the Historical Society, clutching the empty frame. "Mrs. Jenkins," he began, "do you have any records of individuals who might have disappeared from the town's history? Someone intentionally erased?" Mrs. Jenkins's eyes narrowed. "That's a delicate question, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice dropping. "Sometimes families want folks forgotten, especially when there's shame." She eventually pulled out a dusty, leather-bound ledger, labeled Hollow Creek Town Records, 1880 to 1920. She pointed to a faded entry. "There was a young woman, a Miss Evelyn May Thorne," Mrs. Jenkins whispered. "Cyrus Thorne's sister. The same Cyrus Thorne who owned the Silver Creek mine. She was different, spoke her mind, challenged her brother. She advocated for the miners, for the poor. When her brother sealed the mine, she raised a terrible protest. And then, Art pressed, a terrible premonition forming. She simply vanished," Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice barely audible. "Cyrus Thorne claimed she'd run off with a traveling salesman. But every picture of her, every mention in the town paper, it all disappeared too. Like she never existed. Her family wanted her gone. But the valley remembered her courage." Art held the empty frame, now understanding its terrible purpose. It wasn't just a key. It was a memorial to a deliberate erasure. He returned to the cabin, the sun setting, casting long, accusing shadows. He placed the empty frame on the diary's page. The compulsion was not violent or cold, but profoundly sad. A quiet despair for a life silenced and a truth buried. His hand began to write entry number 9. The forgotten sister, Evelyn May Thorne. Entry number 9. The forgotten sister. Some deaths are accidents. Others are deliberate acts of memory. Evelyn May Thorne, sister of the ruthless industrialist Cyrus Thorne, was not just erased from the town records. She was erased from the heart of her family for daring to speak truth to power. The diary wrote of Evelyn's bravery. She was a woman ahead of her time, advocating for the working man, challenging the greed of her brother. She saw the injustice of the sealed mine and threatened to expose Cyrus. Her brother, fearful of scandal, took drastic measures. Evelyn was not killed. She was locked away, confined to the deepest, darkest room in the Thorne estate, slowly driven mad by isolation and the gaslighting of her own family. Her spirit did not die there, but her identity did. Cyrus systematically removed her from every photograph, every official document, every memory, until she became a ghost even while alive. Her spirit does not haunt a place. It haunts history. The forgotten sister is the ghost of obscured truth. She appears as a fleeting, shimmering reflection in glass or water, a momentary glimpse of a woman who almost existed. She seeks only one thing: to be seen, to be remembered, to have her rightful place in the narrative of this valley. Her presence is often heralded by a sudden, inexplicable sense of unseen eyes upon you, as if someone is watching, silently pleading to be acknowledged. Art finished the entry, the sadness heavy in his chest. The empty frame now felt full, brimming with the quiet courage and immense sorrow of Evelyn Maythorne. He felt a profound shift in the cabin's oppressive atmosphere. It was no longer just about terrifying fear, but about the aching need for justice and remembrance. The moral was clear. Attempting to erase truth, no matter how inconvenient or shameful, only strengthens the voice of the forgotten, ensuring that history, like a persistent ghost, will eventually demand to be seen. He looked at the empty frame, then around the cabin. He felt a distinct, almost gentle pressure, as if unseen eyes were finally acknowledging his presence, grateful for the telling of her tale. 9 down, 11 to go. The stories were getting closer, more personal, more deeply woven into the very fabric of the valley and its people. As he closed the diary, Art noticed a new key, placed carefully on the next blank page. It was a single silver locket, tarnished and ancient, but its clasp was broken, and it hung open, revealing nothing inside. It was a symbol of broken promises and a void where love once resided, hinting at a haunting of profound, personal loss. Welcome back to Scary Folktales USA. We have reached the 10th entry in the Queen Victoria Diary. This final story explores the deepest wound of all, the betrayal of the heart, which often creates the quietest, yet most persistent, of ghosts. 9 stories were completed, 9 spiritual chains acknowledged. The air in the cabin, though still cool, felt less hostile. The spirits were restless, but their truths were recorded. The key to the final entry, entry number 10, was a broken silver locket. It lay on the page, its clasp snapped, its two halves unable to meet, symbolizing a bond violently severed. Art picked it up. The sensation was immediate and crushing. The sharp, sudden pain of abandonment. It was the chill of a lonely autumn night, the oppressive weight of a white lace dress, and the sound of silence where there should have been music. This was pure, concentrated grief. He recognized the locket's motif, a simple, elegant engraving of 2 doves, and recalled a brief mention in the Hollow Creek records of Sadie Marsh, a young woman from the 1890s whose fiancé vanished on their wedding day, leaving her heartbroken and alone. She never recovered, eventually dying of a broken heart in the Old Valley Meeting Hall. Art placed the locket on the diary page, his hand cramping with the sorrowful compulsion. The final entry flowed out, written in the same archaic, elegant script, detailing a tragedy not of grand betrayal or industrial greed, but of simple human cruelty. Entry number 10, The Broken Promise. Sadie Marsh was the most beautiful bride in the valley. Her happiness was brief, her tragedy eternal. Her fiancé, a man named Jasper, was not cruel. He was simply weak. On the day of their wedding, overwhelmed by the responsibility of marriage, he fled the valley, leaving Sadie waiting beneath the arbor in the old meeting hall, dressed in her wedding lace. The diary wrote of the quiet devastation. Sadie never raised her voice. She never cried aloud. She sat in the deserted hall for 3 days, refusing food or water, waiting for the promise that would never be kept. She died of profound, silent grief, her soul unwilling to accept the finality of the broken bond. She is the weeping bride. Her ghost does not manifest with screaming or violence. She appears as an overwhelming sorrow in places of great happiness or expectation. The empty benches of the old meeting hall, the porch steps of a new home. Any who feel a sudden, crushing, inexplicable sadness on a day of joy are walking in the shadow of Sadie's grief, a spirit bound by the weight of a vow that was never fulfilled. Art finished the 10th entry. The moment the ink dried, the air went profoundly still. It was the deepest quiet the cabin had known since Art had arrived. The cold hearth receded. The wampus cat's scratching stopped. The diary, for the first time, radiated a sense of completion. Then, the miraculous happened. The broken silver locket, lying on the page, snapped shut. The halves reunited with a faint, final click, sealing the broken promise. A voice, thin and clear, whispered directly into Art's mind. A voice that was neither British nor Appalachian, but purely ancestral. The 10 American sorrows are recorded, Arthur. Now the key. Driven by the whisper, Art examined the spine of the heavy book. His fingers found a faint seam at the base of the brass cap. He pressed, and the leather binding slid open, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Inside lay a heavy, iron key, intricately carved with the letters E. Elspeth Vance. This was the guardian key. Art took the key. He didn't just feel duty, he felt authority. He realized his great-aunt Elspeth had not created the diary. She had split it. The Queen Victoria Diary was a 2-volume history of the Valley's worst sorrows. This book, the one he held, was Volume 1, chronicling the first 10 American hauntings. The other 10 hauntings were contained in Volume 2, which Elspeth had successfully hidden or secured. He used the guardian key to lock the ornate clasp on the cover of the Queen Victoria Diary. The book was now secured. The ghosts he had documented, the miner, the boy, the wampus cat, the hearth, the soldier, the postman, the shadow of the mine, the pastor, the sister, and the bride were not destroyed, but they were contained, their stories told, their suffering acknowledged. The cabin was finally quiet. The profound moral of the locket and the diary was the truth of his inheritance. A broken promise creates a wound that time cannot heal, and true peace is found not in forgetting the sorrow, but in acknowledging the enduring weight of the promise. Art Vance, the reluctant historian, was now the permanent custodian of the 10 American sorrows. He placed the heavy, locked diary on the mantelpiece, knowing his flight back to Boston was indefinitely delayed. He looked out the window, toward the mist-shrouded ridge. The ghost light was gone. The wampus cat was silent. But there were still 10 blank pages, still 10 forgotten tales, still 10 more American hauntings implied by the title, Queen Victoria's Secret Ghost Diary, 20 Hauntings, Hidden from History.